Against the odds, rejected for being too old. But a new man showed her what real love means. The rejection. The train's wheels screeched as it slowed, its final stop drawing closer with every passing moment. The bright Wyoming sky stretched endlessly above, the air dry and crisp, typical of a late autumn morning in the West. Mary Ellen Grant, dressed in her best, most carefully chosen dress, glanced out the train window. Her heart beat erratically as she clutched her carpet bag tightly. It had been a long journey, one filled with hope, anticipation, and a touch of dread. But the hope, for a moment, outweighed the uncertainty. At 52, Mary Ellen had lived a full life, though not always a happy one. She had loved, lost, and endured more heartache than she cared to recall. The pages of her life were marked by quiet moments of loneliness and memories of things that could have been. In her youth, she had been vibrant, full of life, and dreamed of a family of her own. But those dreams had faded as she grew older, as relationships and opportunities slipped through her fingers like sand. She had tried, but the world had never seemed ready for a woman like her. A woman who had seen the passing of time, the weight of years settling around her. Mary Ellen had long since accepted the fact that love, if it ever existed for her, was a thing of the past. But when she saw the ad, when the idea of finding someone who might cherish her, even in her age, appeared on the page, a flicker of hope ignited. It was a long shot, she knew. Women her age were often overlooked, cast aside like old furniture, forgotten by the very society that once celebrated their youth. But she couldn't let that stop her. She had to try. There had to be more to life than this aching silence. The letter from Harlan Pike had come 4 months ago. He was a widowed rancher, a man who had seen much of life's hardships, and he was seeking a companion. Mary Ellen's heart had lifted when she read his words, gentle, thoughtful, and sincere. He seemed kind, with no expectations other than the simple wish for a partner to help with the farm and provide companionship. He'd expressed his appreciation for her qualities, her experience, her warmth. He had seen her as more than just the years that hung upon her shoulders. It was the first time in years that someone had truly looked at her, truly acknowledged her beyond her age. It was a glimpse of a life she had longed for, a second chance at love. So she had made the decision. Despite the misgivings of her sister and friends, despite the doubts gnawing at her, Mary Ellen boarded that train to Rawlins, Wyoming. She wasn't sure what she would find, but the promise of a new life, a life of purpose, was enough to carry her there. She packed her bag with little more than the essentials: clothes, a few keepsakes, and the letter, which she held close to her heart. As the train pulled into the station, Mary Ellen's breath caught. She stood, adjusting her hat, a wide-brimmed thing that had seen better days. She took one last look at the cityscape receding behind her, the bustling streets, the familiar sights she had known for so long, and then stepped onto the dusty platform. The station was small, worn down by years of use, and the air felt heavy with the weight of isolation. A slight wind kicked up, swirling dust around her feet. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. But there was no one there waiting for her. She glanced around, searching the crowd, hoping to catch sight of the man who had promised her a future. The platform was empty, save for a few strangers passing by. Her heart dropped. The train's hiss of departure echoed in the distance, but she felt nothing except the weight of her loneliness. There was no sign of Harlan Pike, no familiar face to greet her. She stood awkwardly in the center of the platform, her gloved hand clutching her bag tightly, trying to make sense of the empty silence surrounding her. Suddenly, a voice called her name, and Mary Ellen turned sharply, her heart skipping a beat. There he was, Harland Pike. At least, she thought it was him. He was taller than she had imagined, with broad shoulders and a sun-browned face. His sandy hair was tousled, and his mustache curled at the edges. He was dressed in a tan duster coat, boots that looked well worn from years of hard work, and a revolver at his hip. He looked like a man who had spent most of his life on horseback, working the land, fighting against the elements. But there was something in his eyes that made her stomach tighten. The warmth she had imagined wasn't there. Instead, there was something colder, more distant, in the way he looked at her. His gaze traveled slowly over her face, down to her graying hair, the slight stoop in her back that she worked so hard to hide. The weight of his stare was crushing. "I thought you were younger," he said flatly, his voice carrying a note of disappointment. Mary Ellen's throat tightened. "You never asked my age," she said, her voice trembling slightly. She had never been one to focus on age. She had always been proud of her experience, her wisdom, and the strength that had carried her through the years. "I didn't need to," he muttered, glancing at the letter she still held in her hands. "I thought that was misprint." Her cheeks burned with shame. She had hoped, at the very least, that his words in the letter had been genuine. She had believed in them, but now, standing before him, she felt as though everything she had hoped for was crumbling. "I wrote you, Mr. Pike," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You said you wanted a companion, someone steady." Harlan's gaze hardened. "What I wanted was someone who could give me sons, not someone done with that kind of life." The words hit her like a slap, the sting of rejection cutting deeper than anything she had ever felt before. Behind her, she could hear the laughter of the young men who had gathered on the porch of the saloon nearby. They were snickering, their voices low, and it made her feel even smaller. She could feel their eyes on her, judging her, as Harlan turned away, his face hardening. "I ain't one to humiliate a lady," he said, his voice stiff, "but I can't marry you. It just wouldn't work." "You already have," she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. Harlan tipped his hat awkwardly, as if trying to make amends. "I'll pay for your train ride back east." "Back east?" She could barely hold back the tears, her voice tight. "I sold everything to get here, Mr. Pike. There's nothing to go back to." But he was already walking away, his boots kicking up dust as he left her standing alone on the platform. A new beginning. Mary Ellen stood alone on the platform as the train pulled away, her heart sinking deeper with every passing second. The silence around her was deafening. She gripped the strap of her carpet bag, the weight of it suddenly unbearable. The shame that rushed through her was like a wave, suffocating in its intensity. She felt as though the years had caught up with her all at once, and for the first time in her life, she wished she could disappear. The town of Rawlins, Wyoming, was as desolate as it seemed. The town square, where she now found herself standing, was dust-choked and despondent. The buildings were old, worn down by the harsh weather, and the street was nearly empty. There was no one waiting for her, no sign of the man who had promised her a future. She had imagined a different welcome, one that was warm and full of hope, not a quiet, awkward emptiness. Her hopes had been dashed in an instant, and now she was left alone to face the reality of her decision. For a moment, she considered leaving, returning to the safety of what she knew. But as she glanced around the town, she realized she had nowhere else to go. No family, no friends who could offer her refuge. She was truly alone, and yet she couldn't bear the thought of returning to the life she had left behind. The quiet, the loneliness, the constant ache of being overlooked. It was suffocating. Without another thought, she turned and walked away from the platform, dragging her feet with each step. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to keep moving forward. For what, though? To try again? To face another disappointment? She didn't know, but the only thing she knew for certain was that she couldn't stay here, at the station, waiting for something that would never come. As she wandered along the edge of the town, trying to collect her thoughts, her stomach growled. The hunger she felt had nothing to do with food, though. It was the hunger for a connection, for something more than the cold reality she was facing. She found a quiet spot near a dry creek bed, where she sat down heavily on the ground, her bag resting beside her. The wind played with her silver blonde hair, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, as though it could protect her from the storm of emotions inside. She had come here, to Rollins, because she believed that there was more to life than the loneliness she had known. She had hoped that Harlan Pike could offer her that. Something warm, something real. But instead, she had found nothing but rejection. She had thought she could be more than just an old woman, more than just a forgotten relic of the past. But maybe she had been wrong. Maybe there was no place for someone like her. Not in this world. She had hoped for something more. But now, all she felt was the weight of her age, her past, and the reality that she had been foolish to dream otherwise. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the sky darkened. The storm that had been threatening all day was finally breaking, and the first few drops of rain began to fall. Mary Ellen rose to her feet, brushing the dirt from her dress. She needed shelter. She needed warmth, not just for her body, but for her soul. She glanced back toward the town, where lights flickered in the distance. There was a cabin just beyond the edge of town, and it seemed like her only option. Without thinking, she began walking toward it, hoping that whoever lived there would offer her the kindness she so desperately needed. Before she could reach the road, however, a voice called out from the shadows. "You lost?" Mary Ellen spun around, startled. From the darkness, a man rode into view, his horse's hooves soft on the packed dirt. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a weathered face. His coat was dusted with trail grime, and a rifle was slung across his saddle. The lantern hanging from his saddle cast a soft glow, illuminating his features. "I don't take kindly to sneaking up on folks, sir," she said, her voice steady, despite the unease that crawled up her spine. The last thing she needed was trouble, especially in a strange town with no one to help her. The man didn't appear threatening, though. He dismounted gracefully, and his eyes were sharp, but not unkind. "I didn't mean to sneak," he said, his voice calm. "I saw you walking toward the gulch. Dangerous out here after dark." Mary Ellen straightened, trying to maintain her composure. She had faced enough in her life to know when to stand tall and when to retreat. "I've seen worse," she replied, lifting her chin. He studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then, to her surprise, he spoke again. "Name's Thomas Beckett. I've got a cabin not far from here. Got food, warmth, a fire. You look like you could use all three." Mary Ellen hesitated. She had learned to be wary of strangers, especially men, but something in his voice felt genuine. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the way he assessed her without judgment. Maybe it was foolish, but she was tired. Tired of being alone. Tired of pretending she didn't need help. Her pride had already taken a beating. What was one more dent? "Thank you, Mr. Beckett," she said softly. "I'll accept your offer." Without another word, Thomas Beckett helped her onto his horse. As they rode towards the cabin, the storm began to pick up, the wind howling and the rain falling harder. By the time they reached the cabin, the storm was in full force. Mary Ellen could feel the cold, the dampness seeping into her bones. But she was also filled with a sense of relief. At least for tonight, she would be safe. Finding shelter in the storm. The small cabin was a refuge from the storm, both outside and within Mary Ellen's heart. The wind howled through the cracks in the cabin's walls, but inside, the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth offered her a sense of comfort she hadn't felt in years. The scent of wood smoke and stew filled the air, and as she sank into the sturdy rocking chair near the fire, she felt her tension slowly melt away. For the first time in days, she let her guard down. Thomas Beckett moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of a life lived in solitude. He seemed to know exactly what to do, setting about the task of making sure the cabin was secure against the storm. His hands were steady and sure, movements honed by years of practice. She watched him for a moment, noticing the way he moved with purpose, the way his rough hands made everything seem effortless. "You look like you could use some warmth," he said, his voice gruff but kind, as he handed her a steaming mug of coffee. Mary Ellen took it gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around the warm ceramic. The heat seeped into her bones, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe without the heavy weight of loneliness pressing down on her. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice quieter than usual. She wasn't used to accepting help, especially from strangers. But tonight, something about Thomas felt different. He wasn't asking for anything in return, and that was a rare thing for a woman like her, used to being overlooked and rejected. Thomas nodded as he sat across from her, watching her with a quiet intensity. "I don't mean to intrude," he said after a beat, "but you look like you've been through a lot." Mary Ellen gave a small, tired smile. "I suppose you could say that." She hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. Her life had been a series of disappointments, and she was reluctant to burden anyone with her past. But Thomas was different. There was a calmness about him, a steadiness that made her feel safe enough to speak, just a little. "I came here looking for something," she said, her voice faltering for just a moment. "A chance, a new life, but I was wrong. Harland, he turned me away, said I was too old." Thomas didn't react, just nodded thoughtfully. His gaze never left hers, and there was no judgment in his eyes, just an understanding that made her feel, for the first time in a long while, that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't invisible. "He didn't know what he was looking for," Thomas said quietly, almost to himself. "Maybe he thought he did, but it wasn't you. Some people don't know how to recognize what they need when it's right in front of them." The words stung, but they were not cruel. They were gentle, almost comforting. Mary Ellen hadn't realized how much she needed to hear them until now. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her without the shadow of judgment or pity in their voice. "Maybe," she said softly, her heart aching with a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. "Maybe I was just hoping for something that wasn't meant to be." Thomas didn't respond right away. Instead, he added another log to the fire and poured himself a cup of coffee. When he finally spoke, His voice was steady, unhurried. Sometimes life takes us in directions we don't understand, but that doesn't mean we failed. It just means there's something else waiting for us. We don't always see it right away, but it's there. Mary Ellen looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. The ruggedness in his features, the deep lines etched from years of hard work, the quiet strength in the way he carried himself. It all came together in a way that was difficult to define, but unmistakable once she recognized it. Thomas Becket was a man who had known pain, who had known loss, but who still stood tall, unbroken, and now, here he was, offering her something she hadn't expected to find: kindness, acceptance, and a sense of belonging. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do next," she admitted, her voice trembling with the vulnerability she had long kept buried. "I thought maybe I had found my place, but now I'm not so sure." Thomas looked at her, his expression softening. "You'll figure it out," he said simply. "You've already come this far, haven't you? Sometimes the hardest part is just showing up." Mary Ellen stared into the fire, watching the flames dance in the hearth. She had come here seeking love, but what she had found was something even more profound: a sense of connection, of being seen for who she truly was, not just the age she had reached or the circumstances she had endured. Thomas hadn't looked at her with pity or disdain. He had looked at her with respect, as though she were worthy of that respect, simply because she was herself. "I never thought I'd find anyone who would accept me as I am," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "I've spent so much of my life trying to please everyone else, trying to be something I'm not. But now, I don't know who I am anymore." "You're Mary Ellen Crowley," Thomas said softly, as though the words were enough to remind her of the woman she had always been. "And that's enough." Mary Ellen felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't heard anyone speak to her like that in years. It was simple, but it was all she needed to hear. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't too old. She was enough. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire, the steady rhythm of Thomas's movements, and the quiet companionship they shared were enough to fill the silence. She didn't feel alone anymore, not completely, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope stir within her, a glimmer that perhaps, just perhaps, she could have something more. A life worth living, a life that was hers, and hers alone. The unspoken connection. The storm outside howled louder, but inside the small cabin, the crackling warmth of the fire was a welcome reprieve. Mary Ellen sat in the sturdy rocking chair, her fingers gripping the edges of the faded quilt wrapped around her. The rich smell of rabbit stew lingered in the air, and the crackling fire seemed to carry with it a strange sense of comfort. But despite the warmth that surrounded her, an unfamiliar chill remained deep inside her chest. She had come to this place for hope, for a chance at something new, but it felt like her past was still clinging to her like a shadow, impossible to escape. Across from her, Thomas Becket moved, with quiet efficiency, placing another log into the fire. His movements were methodical, as though he had been living in solitude for far longer than he cared to remember. Mary Ellen watched him, unsure of what to say, but knowing something inside her had shifted. The raw kindness in his eyes, the way he listened without judgment, was unlike anything she had ever encountered before. For so many years, she had longed for someone to see her, not just as a woman of a certain age, but as someone with dreams, with worth, with a life still waiting to be fully lived. Harland had dismissed her so easily, and it had cut deep. He had judged her age, her past, as though they made her less worthy of love, of companionship. But now, here she was, sitting in a small cabin with a man who didn't care about her age or her history. He simply saw her. Mary Ellen's fingers tightened around the quilt as the memory of Harland's rejection replayed in her mind. "Too old," he had said, his words cutting through her heart like a jagged knife. "I wanted someone to give me sons," he had added. But what about her? She wondered. Wasn't she allowed to have love in her life too, despite her age? Wasn't she allowed to find joy again, even if it was a second chance? The rejection stung, but what hurt even more was how it had confirmed the insecurities she had carried with her for so many years. She wasn't young enough to be a bride. She wasn't beautiful enough to be desired. And now, she had come to a place where the promise of something new had been shattered. Yet, here she was, in the presence of a man who seemed to understand her pain without saying a word. Thomas Beckett was different from the men she had known. He wasn't seeking validation. He wasn't looking to impress her with promises of wealth or security. He was simply here, offering her a space to breathe, to exist without expectations. His silence wasn't awkward. It was comfortable. There was a deep, unspoken understanding between them, as if both were carrying burdens too heavy to share with anyone else. She had learned that silence didn't always have to be filled with discomfort. Sometimes it was simply the space needed to allow people to heal. And in that silence, Mary Ellen found something she hadn't expected: peace. Thomas, despite the loss of his wife, had not rushed to fill the void left behind. He had lived quietly, with purpose and resilience, maintaining his ranch, enduring his solitude. Yet, when he spoke of his late wife, there was a tenderness in his voice that Mary Ellen couldn't help but notice. He wasn't looking for someone to replace her. No, he was looking for someone who understood that love was not about finding the perfect person. It was about finding someone who could walk beside you, sharing in the journey of life. As they sat by the fire, the rain now beating steadily against the windows, Thomas shared more of his past with her. His wife, Hannah, had passed 5 years ago from a fever. It had been sudden, and there was nothing he could do. His voice had been steady as he spoke, but Mary Ellen could hear the ache that still lingered in his words. "She was strong, smarter than me," he said with a faint smile. But life had a different plan. Mary Ellen could relate to his loss more than she cared to admit. She, too, had lost so much in her life. Her first husband, who had died when their son was just 2 years old, had left a wound that never quite healed. The grief of losing a child, especially so young, had hollowed her out in ways she didn't know how to describe. She never expected to feel whole again. But sitting here with Thomas, someone who had also known the devastation of loss, she felt an understanding between them. It wasn't that their pain was the same, but it was the recognition of the quiet suffering that both carried. The world had tried to move on without them, but they had stayed behind, living in the shadow of what had once been. After their meal, as Thomas moved around the cabin, setting things in order, Mary Ellen found herself reflecting on the kind of woman she had become. She had spent so many years being told she was too old, too worn out to be loved. Her entire existence had been shaped by other people's expectations of her, first as a wife, then as a mother. But now, sitting in this cabin with Thomas, she realized something. She wasn't done. She wasn't too old for love. She wasn't too broken to start again. The world may have dismissed her, but that didn't mean she had to accept their judgment. She had survived. She had endured. And now, she was standing at the precipice of something new. A chance at a life she hadn't thought was possible. Her eyes glanced over at Thomas, who was sitting by the fire, his expression contemplative. His presence was calming, yet there was something else, a quiet intensity. He wasn't just a man who had lost. He was a man who had lived through it and had found a way to move forward. She wanted to ask him about it, wanted to know how he had found the strength to keep going. But instead, she simply asked, "What now?" Thomas met her gaze, his expression softening. "Now, we keep moving," he said simply, "one step at a time." As the night wore on, the storm outside began to die down. The tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet sense of comfort. For the first time in days, Mary Ellen felt like she could breathe. The weight of rejection, the sting of loss, was still there, but it no longer defined her. Thomas stood and stretched, then turned to her with a small smile. "You know," he said, "there's a dance in town on Saturday." Mary Ellen raised an eyebrow. "A dance?" He nodded. "You dance?" She hesitated, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Not well, but I suppose I could try." Thomas grinned. "Good. We'll give them something to talk about." Her heart skipped a beat. For so long, she had hidden herself away, fearing the judgment of others. But now, with Thomas by her side, she realized something. She didn't need to hide anymore. She wasn't too old for this life. She wasn't too broken for love, and she certainly wasn't too much for him. As she stood, she could feel the stirrings of something new inside her. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just the simple joy of being seen. And in that moment, with the storm behind her and the promise of tomorrow in front of her, she finally allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was worthy of a love that would stand the test of time. The dance of new beginnings. The day of the dance arrived in Rollins, and Mary Ellen found herself standing in front of the small mirror in Thomas's cabin, adjusting the simple lilac dress he had helped her pick out from a nearby store. It was a modest thing, not the grand gowns she had once dreamed of wearing, but it was comfortable, fitting her form perfectly. The softness of the fabric and the pale color reflected a sense of renewal, a new chapter in her life that was just beginning. She touched her hair, pinning it back with a few silver clips, and for the first time, in what seemed like forever, she didn't feel ashamed of her age. She felt right. Thomas had been insistent on taking her to the dance, despite her initial hesitations. She hadn't danced in years. How could she, after everything that had happened? She had spent too many years hiding from her own reflection, unsure of who she had become, and unsure if anyone could see past the years, the lines, the scars. But Thomas saw her, truly saw her, and that made all the difference. Thomas entered the room just as she was finishing with her hair, his gaze immediately softening when he saw her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was an unspoken recognition between them, a feeling of anticipation, but also a quiet understanding. They had both suffered, both been rejected in their own ways. Yet here they were, standing in the same room, on the brink of something new. "You look beautiful," Thomas said, his voice steady, but with an edge of tenderness she hadn't expected. Mary Ellen turned to face him, her heart fluttering in her chest. She hadn't heard those words in so long, and they carried more weight than she could have anticipated. It wasn't just about the compliment. It was the way he said it. It was genuine. It was real. And it made her feel, for the first time in a long time, like she was worthy of love. "Thank you," she replied, her voice softer than she had intended. "I wasn't sure about this. I don't even know if I remember how to dance." Thomas smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "It doesn't matter. We're just two people enjoying the night. Who cares if we're clumsy?" She laughed, a sound that felt foreign at first, but then warmed her chest. "I suppose we could be terrible together." "That's the best part," Thomas said, extending his arm. "Shall we?" For a moment, Mary Ellen hesitated, but then she placed her hand in his. The simple contact was enough to send a wave of warmth through her. It was as if this one gesture, this small movement, was everything she had been waiting for. She wasn't afraid anymore, not of the dance, not of the town's eyes on her, and not of the future. The walk to the town hall was short but filled with a quiet energy. The air was crisp with the fading remnants of the storm, and the earth smelled fresh, almost as though it, too, was waiting for the night to unfold. Mary Ellen felt Thomas's steady presence beside her, his arm around her shoulders, offering a comforting sense of safety. There was something different about him, something that spoke of strength and resilience, but also of gentleness and patience. As they entered the dance hall, the sounds of fiddles and banjos filled the room, a lively, upbeat tune that made the floor creak under the weight of the dancing couples. The town seemed to come alive in a way Mary Ellen hadn't seen before. She had spent years on the outskirts of life, but now, surrounded by laughter and joy, she was finally feeling like part of something again. The room fell into a brief, almost imperceptible silence when they entered. Mary Ellen knew the eyes were on her, on both of them, but instead of shrinking away, she met their gazes. She had faced rejection before, but tonight she was determined to let it slide off her. The whispers followed her, as they always did, but they didn't matter. She wasn't here for their approval. She was here for herself. She was here for the life she was reclaiming. Thomas led her to the center of the room, and as the music began again, they took their first steps together. It was awkward at first. Her feet stumbled over his, and she felt his hand on her waist shift slightly as he adjusted to her movements. But soon enough, the rhythm took over, and the two of them found a quiet harmony in their movements. She wasn't the graceful woman she once thought she could be, but with Thomas, she didn't have to be. She simply had to be herself. The music swept them away in a whirl of twirls and soft steps, and for the first time in ages, Mary Ellen felt a lightness in her chest. She wasn't thinking about her age or the years that had passed her by. She was lost in the moment, in the way Thomas's hand felt on her back, in the way he looked at her as if she were the only woman in the room. But despite the joy that radiated between them, the room still whispered. A few of the younger women looked at Mary Ellen with pity, some with judgment. There were murmurs about how out of place she seemed, about how she was too old to be here, too old to be dancing with someone like Thomas. The words were subtle, but Mary Ellen could feel them. She could always feel them. But this time, she didn't care. Thomas must have sensed her discomfort, for he leaned in close, his breath warm against her ear. "Don't listen to them," he said quietly. "This is our dance, not theirs." Her heart fluttered, and she looked up at him, surprised. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, not for her age, not for her past, but for who she was in that moment. She wasn't a woman who had been discarded. She was a woman who had lived, who had loved, who had survived, and that made her strong. The dance continued, and with each step, with each graceful turn, the whispers became distant. They couldn't touch her anymore. Not while she was in Thomas's arms, not while she was surrounded by the music and the warmth of this new chapter she was stepping into. After the dance ended, Mary Ellen stepped outside to catch her breath. The night air was cool, and the stars were scattered across the sky like diamonds. She leaned against the porch railing, her hands gripping the edges tightly as she looked out over the town. For the first time, the weight of her past didn't feel so heavy. It wasn't that she had forgotten everything she had been through. It was that she had finally come to terms with it. Thomas stepped outside to join her, his presence steady and reassuring. He didn't speak immediately, just stood beside her, offering her the space to breathe, to think. He knew, without her saying a word, what this night meant for her. "I haven't felt this free in years," Mary Ellen said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas looked at her, his eyes filled with understanding. "You deserve to feel free. You deserve to be happy." She nodded, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes. This was the man who saw her, not just for what she had been, but for who she was now. And that was all she had ever wanted, to be seen, to be loved. As they stood there, side by side, watching the stars twinkle above them, Mary Ellen realized something she hadn't allowed herself to believe for years. That love wasn't a thing of the past. It wasn't something reserved for the young or the perfect. It was something that could be found at any age, in any moment, and it was hers to embrace. Thomas took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'd like to take you to dinner tomorrow," he said. "I think we could use some time away from the dance floor." Mary Ellen smiled softly. "I'd like that very much." And as the night wrapped around them, the dance had ended, but their story had only just begun. Finding joy and love in each other's arms. The sun was beginning to set over the rugged Wyoming landscape, casting long shadows across the cabin's porch, where Mary Ellen and Thomas sat side by side. The world around them seemed to fade into the background as they found solace in each other's presence. The journey they had started together was far from easy, but each moment, each shared glance, was becoming a new chapter. Neither of them had expected, but both were desperately hoping for. After a long day of working on the ranch, fixing fences, and preparing the land for winter, Mary Ellen found herself enjoying the evening more than she ever thought possible. The physical exhaustion was there, but it was the kind of weariness that felt fulfilling, not oppressive. She had grown used to the silence of solitude, but now she found the silence with Thomas to be a comfortable one, a kind that was filled with understanding, peace, and the quiet rhythm of two people content with each other. "Thomas," Mary Ellen began, her voice soft, "this land, it's so beautiful. I never thought I could find peace like this." Thomas, who had been leaning against the porch rail, his hand wrapped around a mug of coffee, looked at her with a knowing smile. "The land's been good to me, but it's always felt emptier without someone to share it with." Mary Ellen's heart fluttered at his words. She wasn't used to hearing such things, especially from a man who had seen so much hardship. His sincerity was disarming, and in that moment, she realized just how deeply their lives had intertwined in such a short time. She had come here to escape the past, to find something different, something real. And now, with Thomas, she felt she was on the edge of something she had never imagined. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the last rays of the sun disappear behind the distant hills. The air was cool, and the scent of wood smoke from the cabin's chimney mingled with the earthiness of the surrounding forest. "Do you miss it?" she asked, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Your wife, I mean. Do you ever think about what life could have been like with her?" Thomas took a deep breath, his expression softening. "Every day, Mary Ellen. But time has a way of teaching you that you can't live in the past. You honor it, you remember the good parts, and then you move forward." She nodded, understanding the weight in his words. She had spent so much of her life clinging to the past, the rejection, the heartache, the loneliness. But now, sitting beside Thomas, she felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had finally begun to lift. Mary Ellen's eyes met his, and there was an unspoken understanding between them. Thomas wasn't asking her to forget her past, just as he wasn't forgetting his, but they were both learning to let go of the pain, to stop defining themselves by their previous heartbreaks. For the first time in years, Mary Ellen felt a flicker of hope, something that wasn't just wishful thinking, but a real possibility. She realized that this new chapter with Thomas could be something special, not because it erased her past, but because it allowed her to see beyond it. Later that evening, Thomas suggested they take a walk under the stars. The night sky in Wyoming was unlike anything Mary Ellen had ever seen. The stars were so clear, so close. It felt as though you could reach up and touch them. She felt a sense of awe wash over her, the vastness of the sky reminding her of just how much the world had to offer, even when it seemed small and confining. As they walked, they spoke of everything and nothing. Thomas shared stories of his ranching days, of the hardships he'd faced, the family he'd lost, and the quiet moments that had kept him going. Mary Ellen, in turn, opened up about her own past. The years spent longing for love, the disappointment of being overlooked, the emotional bruises that had never truly healed. Thomas listened without judgment, his gaze steady and kind, as if he understood her in ways no one else had ever bothered to. She realized then that it wasn't just his words that comforted her, but the quiet strength he exuded, the way he didn't try to fix everything, but instead allowed her to be exactly who she was. "You know," Thomas said after a long pause, his voice thoughtful, "I've spent a lot of time alone out here, but I never really felt lonely until I met you." Mary Ellen stopped walking and turned to face him, surprised by his admission. "I don't know what to say to that." "You don't have to say anything," he replied, stepping closer. I think that's just how it is. Sometimes you don't know what's missing until it shows up, and then it feels like it's always been meant to be there." Her heart fluttered again, but this time, it wasn't from anxiety or fear. It was from something new, something freeing. She had come to expect disappointment, but now, in Thomas's presence, she was starting to realize that she was worthy of love, worthy of someone seeing her for who she truly was. They continued their walk in silence, the connection between them deepening with each step. By the time they returned to the cabin, the night had grown quiet, and the cool air had settled into a peaceful stillness. Thomas helped Mary Ellen inside, and they sat by the fire, the warmth wrapping around them like a protective blanket. Thomas poured them both a cup of coffee, and they sat in comfortable silence, enjoying the peacefulness of the evening. For the first time in a long time, Mary Ellen felt truly at ease, her heart open, her mind clear. "You know," she said after a while, her voice soft, "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about not living in the past. Thomas looked at her, his expression warm. I meant it. We can't change what's behind us, Mary Ellen, but we have the power to shape what comes next. She smiled, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. I think you're right. I think I'm ready to let go of what's holding me back. Thomas's smile mirrored hers, and in that moment, Mary Ellen felt a sense of clarity. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, and with Thomas by her side, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The night stretched on, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. They didn't speak much after that, but the words weren't necessary. They both knew what was happening between them. Something real, something lasting. The storm outside had passed, but a different kind of storm had entered their lives. One of new beginnings, of fresh starts, and of love that wasn't afraid to bloom when the time was right. As Mary Ellen lay down that night, wrapped in the warmth of the blanket, she allowed herself to finally sleep, knowing that tomorrow would be another step forward. She was no longer the woman who had been rejected, forgotten, or overlooked. She was a woman who had found her place in the world, and that place was beside Thomas, in the quiet warmth of their shared future. Tomorrow, she would be ready for whatever came next, because this time, she knew she wasn't alone. A love beyond expectations. The following days passed by in a gentle, steady rhythm. The mornings were spent with Thomas, working together to repair fences, mend broken tools, and tend to the ranch. The quiet labor felt less like a burden and more like a shared experience, one that allowed Mary Ellen to feel a sense of purpose she had longed for her entire life. The hard work, while physically demanding, brought them closer, and each time their hands brushed or their eyes met, it was as if a deeper connection was being formed, one that was grounded in respect, understanding, and affection. Mary Ellen found herself noticing the small details, how Thomas's eyes would crinkle at the corners when he smiled, the steady way he moved through his work, the quiet strength in his voice when he spoke. It wasn't the flashy kind of romance she had once dreamed of. No, this was different. This was real. It was a love that didn't need grand gestures, just two people finding comfort and peace in each other's presence. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the land, Thomas invited Mary Ellen to take a walk with him again. It had become a routine of sorts, a peaceful escape from the duties of the day, where they could talk freely or simply enjoy the silence between them. This time, however, Thomas seemed particularly eager to share something. Mary Ellen, he began, his tone more serious than usual. I've been thinking about this for a while, about us. Mary Ellen looked at him, her heart skipping a beat. She had felt this connection growing stronger with each passing day, but hearing him speak of it so openly made her chest tighten with both anticipation and fear. I know things moved quickly, he continued, his gaze soft, but I can't deny what's been happening between us. I've spent so many years alone, and I didn't think I'd ever feel like this again. Mary Ellen smiled softly, her heart swelling at his words. She had been afraid to voice her own feelings, unsure of what Thomas might think or how he might react. But now, standing before him in the fading light of the day, she realized just how much she had come to care for him. I feel the same way, she replied, her voice quiet but firm. I never expected this. I didn't think I could ever open myself up to someone again, not after all I've been through. Thomas reached for her hand, his fingers warm and reassuring against her skin. I know you've been through a lot, but I see you, Mary Ellen. I see everything that makes you who you are. And that's why I want to ask you something. She felt a flutter of nervous excitement in her stomach, her breath catching in her throat. What is it? He took a deep breath, as if gathering his thoughts, and then looked into her eyes with a steady, unwavering gaze. I want to build a life with you, not just here on this land, but in every way that matters. I want to see you happy, Mary Ellen. I want to be there for you, for everything. Will you stay with me? Not just for now, but for all of it? Tears welled up in her eyes as his words sank in. She hadn't dared to dream of something like this. Something so pure, so honest. It wasn't about grand declarations or promises that could never be kept. No, it was about the quiet strength in his voice, the sincerity in his eyes, and the unwavering support he had shown her from the very beginning. I don't know what to say, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. But yes, Thomas. Yes, I want that too. I want to build a life with you. And in that moment, something shifted within her. The fear, the doubt, the pain that had once clouded her heart, all of it began to fade away. There was no more waiting for the right time, no more holding on to a past that had only hurt her. With Thomas, she had found the future she never knew she deserved. And it wasn't just about love. It was about partnership, understanding, and finding joy in the little things. Over the next few weeks, Mary Ellen and Thomas's bond grew even deeper. They spent their days working together, their nights filled with quiet conversation and laughter. Thomas would often surprise her with small acts of kindness, leaving flowers on the porch, bringing her favorite coffee to the cabin, or simply holding her hand as they watched the stars together. It wasn't the type of romance that the world often celebrated, but it was a love that felt truer than anything she had ever imagined. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sky turn from orange to deep purple, Thomas turned to her with a smile. You know, he said, I'm glad I found you, not just because of what we've built here together, but because you remind me that there's more to life than just surviving. Mary Ellen laughed softly, leaning her head on his shoulder. I never thought I'd be able to say that I'm happy again, Thomas, but here I am. And it was true. She had come to Wyoming expecting to escape the disappointments of her past. But what she found instead was a love she never thought possible. A love that grew quietly, steadily, in the simplest of moments. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that was all that mattered. A few days later, as Mary Ellen walked through the fields with Thomas, she realized something. She had spent her whole life defining herself by the things she lacked, the love she had never found, the chances she had missed. But now, standing on the land she had come to love, with the man she had come to cherish, she saw that she wasn't defined by her past. She was defined by who she had become, the woman who was brave enough to love again, to trust again, and to believe that she was worthy of a future that was hers to create. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden light over the landscape. Mary Ellen turned to Thomas, her heart full. I'm ready for whatever comes next, she said softly. Thomas smiled, his eyes filled with warmth and admiration. So am I. And as they stood there, hand in hand, looking out at the land they would build their future on, Mary Ellen knew that this was just the beginning. They had both been through their share of heartache, but now they had each other. Together, they would face whatever challenges the future held, knowing that love had already proven to be the greatest gift of all. a future together. As the days grew longer and the seasons began to shift, Mary Ellen and Thomas found their life together, settling into a rhythm that felt like a dream. The work never stopped. There were always fences to mend, crops to tend to, and livestock to care for. But with each passing day, Mary Ellen felt more connected to the land, to Thomas, and most importantly, to herself. She had spent so many years doubting her worth, letting the weight of her past decisions cloud her future. But with Thomas by her side, she had found a new sense of purpose and peace. One day, as they worked side by side in the fields, Mary Ellen paused to wipe the sweat from her brow. The sun was high, casting a golden glow over everything, and she turned to look at Thomas, who was hunched over, adjusting the reins of one of the horses. "I never thought I could love a place as much as I love this," she said, her voice full of contentment. "It's not just the land. It's everything. It's you. This life we're building together." Thomas straightened up, dusting off his hands. He looked at her with that quiet, steady gaze she had come to love. "It's not the place, Mary Ellen. It's the people, and the one person in it who made everything worth it." She smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. She had never thought that love could feel this easy, this natural. But with Thomas, every moment felt like a gift. "Promise me something," he said, his voice low but earnest. "Promise me we'll keep doing this. Keep building, keep living, and never look back." She met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. "I promise." That evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip beneath the horizon, they talked about the future. It wasn't about grand dreams or sweeping changes. It was about small things. Growing old together, maybe starting a family of their own, and continuing to live the life they had worked so hard to create. "I know we can't change the past," Thomas said, his voice tinged with reflection. "But we have today, and I want to spend every single day with you." Mary Ellen's heart fluttered at his words. She had never imagined that a second chance at love could feel so fulfilling. But in Thomas, she had found everything she had been searching for: honesty, strength, and a love that didn't need to be perfect to be real. "I want that too," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "I want us to have a future where we can keep growing, keep loving, together." The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Slowly, they began to build the life they had promised each other. Thomas had always been a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. Every morning, he was up before the sun, taking care of the animals and preparing the land for the new season's crops. And every evening, he made sure Mary Ellen had everything she needed, whether it was a hot meal or a quiet moment on the porch. And Mary Ellen, she found herself taking on more than she ever thought she could. She was no longer the woman who had stepped off the train, unsure of her worth, rejected and humiliated by her past. She was a woman of strength, capable of loving fiercely and building a future filled with hope. One chilly morning, as winter began to take its hold, Mary Ellen stood in front of the small cabin, bundled in a thick coat, watching the first snowflakes fall. She loved how the snow blanketed everything, transforming the familiar landscape into something new and beautiful. Thomas joined her outside, his breath visible in the crisp air. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "You've changed everything for me, Mary Ellen," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd feel this way again, but now I can't imagine life without you." Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked up at him. "You've changed me, Thomas. You've shown me that love isn't about finding perfection. It's about finding someone who accepts you as you are and makes you better every single day." For the first time in years, she truly understood what it meant to be loved and to love in return. It wasn't the grand gestures that mattered. It was the little things. The way Thomas always listened when she spoke. The way he worked alongside her without complaint. The way he made her feel like she was enough, just as she was. "I don't need much," she said softly. "Just you, just this life." And that, she realized, was everything. A few months later, on a warm spring evening, Thomas took Mary Ellen's hand and led her out to the field. The sun was just beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. He stopped in the middle of the field, turning to her with a small, shy smile. "Mary Ellen," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "We've built something beautiful here, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you, in every way that matters. Will you marry me?" Her heart stopped for a moment, and she stared at him, wide-eyed in surprise. But then, a smile broke across her face, and she felt the tears well up in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." And there, under the open sky, with the wind in her hair and the earth beneath her feet, Mary Ellen knew that this was it, the beginning of the rest of their lives, together. The future they had dreamed of, the future they had built, was finally within their reach. Their wedding was a small, intimate affair, held right there on the land they had come to love so much. The weather was perfect, the sun shining down, as they exchanged vows surrounded by friends who had become family. Mary Ellen wore a simple dress she had made herself, her silver hair pinned back in a way that made her feel beautiful in her own skin. As they danced under the stars, Mary Ellen felt something she hadn't felt in years: complete. She wasn't just the woman who had been rejected, the woman who had once felt unworthy of love. No, she was someone else now. She was the woman who had found love again. Someone who had proved that no matter how old you are, or how many mistakes you've made, it's never too late to be loved. Thomas held her close, his arms steady around her, and whispered, "I'm so glad you came into my life, Mary Ellen. You make everything worth it." Tears pricked at her eyes as she rested her head on his chest, her heart full of gratitude. "I'm glad too, Thomas. I never thought I would find this kind of love, but now that I have, I'll never let it go." And as the music played and the stars shone above them, Mary Ellen knew that her life had finally come full circle. She had found the love she had always deserved, the love that had been waiting for her all along. Together, they would face whatever came their way, and together, they would build a future that was richer, fuller, and more meaningful than either of them had ever imagined. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What are your thoughts on love and second chances? Is it ever too late to find happiness?